Hello and welcome to the Digital Storm Aventum 3 Water Block Replacement Guide. In this guide, I'll show you how to take apart your computer, remove your old damaged water block, and replace it with a new one, and get everything back up and running so you can get back to using your computer. Now, one thing about this guide, it is a pretty long and drawn out process. We would recommend having at least a few hours set aside or more. The main thing is you just don't want to rush through this guide. There's a lot of little steps. Some things might go quicker, some things might go a little longer. So just make sure you have the adequate time to go through this without rushing. Now, when you get your computer set up, there is a lot of fluid inside of these computers. I've got clear fluid here. You might have blue, orange, purple, pink, any sort of crazy awesome color, which looks amazing inside of your computer and probably looks absolutely terrible on your carpet. So leaks are something that could potentially happen. If you have carpet underneath the computer, probably best to move this to a garage or workspace or somewhere where if we do get a fluid spill, we can quickly mop it up. With that said, we're now on to the point where I can talk about the tools and all the things you will need to accomplish this task. A standard-sized Phillips head screwdriver, preferably with a sharp tip. A pair of needle nose pliers, about the size of the ones here. A pair of wire cutters, just in case we need to cut a zip tie. Probably won't need to, but good to have on standby. A medium to large paperclip, or one of these 24-pin power jump connectors. When we get to the point in the video where we are adding fluid and refilling the computer, there is a possibility that either the system will suck down our reservoir and it'll start running dry before we can put more fluid in it, or the system might exhibit a leak where we have to power the system off quickly to then address that leak before fluid gets everywhere. In either of those cases, we're powering off the computer, but we could be in a state where Windows is in the process of booting or loading up. If we cut power in that process, we now run the risk of corrupting Windows, and we'll have a computer that physically functions, but an operating system that is useless. So to avoid that, we can either pull the operating system drive, which prevents the system from booting off of it, or corrupting it. If we can't get to the drive, like in some systems, it's buried behind video cards, and if you have hardline cooling, those little M.2 drives can be very difficult to get to. Whatever reason, if you cannot get to your drives to pull them, or you have a complicated RAID array and you don't want to mess with them, then the best option is to just jump the power supply. Now that can be done with either this paperclip or this jump connector. This works perfectly well. I've done this a lot of times. It is kind of sketchy for some people to unbend this and jam it into pins in their power supply. So if that's not something that you feel comfortable or feel safe doing, then go ahead and pick up one of these little jump connectors. They do the same thing, just in a far less sketchy manner. I'll go ahead and put some links in the video description for these. You should be able to find them on most online retailers, and some local computer stores will probably have these as well. A water bucket for catching the water in our computer. This one holds about a gallon. It's this rectangular shape. Yours can be square, round, doesn't really matter. Just needs to be something that's large, open, that you can put fluid into that holds about a gallon. Also, whatever you choose, make sure it's clean because the fluid that's going in here will be going back into your computer. The next thing we're going to need is some sort of a device to get the fluid out of our reservoir into this bucket, and then from this bucket back to this reservoir. Now to accomplish that, I've put together something of parts that I found at a local hardware store. This super cheap squeeze bottle and some plastic catheter tubing. Now if you have this newer style of reservoir like this one shown here, there's a small fill port on the top. That fill port has a maximum diameter of 3/8 outer diameter for your tubing. If you get tubing any larger than 3/8, it's not going to fit. 3/8 fits fine. So when you go to your store, try to find a bottle, match it with 3/8 outer diameter, make sure that they kind of fit together like this, and you have everything you need to empty and fill this reservoir. The next thing you may not need, but I'd highly recommend picking it up just in case, is an extra bottle of fluid. Now going through this, if all goes according to plan, you're probably going to lose a small amount of fluid. Your reservoir might be a little bit lower when you started. That's not really going to affect the overall quality of the cooling system, but having extra on standby is nice, both in case you have a leak in the system and you need to add more fluid, or you just want to top this off and visually have it look just like it did before we started this whole process. Bottle of fluid is a good thing to have on hand. Plus, if you ever need to do maintenance or repairs later on, having one of these on standby is a good thing to have. Now, if you're not sure what type of fluid is in your system, definitely contact our support staff. We use a huge range of fluids, from clear, semi-opaque, opaque, stuff that looks like it came out of a warp core. So whatever fluid that was in your system, we want to make sure that we match that with the same identical fluid. Otherwise, it could lead to corrosion and other issues. Also, another note with this fluid, I've gotten it on my hands, haven't really had any problems before. It's not ultra toxic, but it does have a warning on the bottle that if you have sensitive skin or a known skin condition, that this could cause irritation. So if you fall into that category, make sure you wear some sort of rubber gloves or protective gloves while handling this. Otherwise, you should probably be fine. Now this stuff is, I'm pretty sure, toxic, so you definitely don't want to ingest it. So if you have pets or small kids or anywhere that would be around this computer, definitely make sure to take the precautions to put this fluid up in a safe place while working on the computer. The next thing is paper towel. Never, never underestimate paper towel. Paper towel is a great thing to have with this. Anytime you're working with fluid, we don't anticipate any major leaks, but if they do occur, this is going to be your safety net to quickly mop things up and keep that fluid from going places that you don't want to go. That pretty much is all the tools we will need. There is one extra tool that you may or may not need. For those of you with soft line liquid cooling, you're going to need 2 of these tube segments with quick disconnect fittings. Now this is something that the support staff should have sent you already along with your new block. What we'll use these for is to plug into the quick disconnects on our system. One will give air into the line, the other one will drain fluid out, so it will open the entire loop and allow fluid to drain freely. Now when you get yours, they might be different colors, black, silver, different color tubes. That doesn't matter. These are just temporary tubes, so you should get something like this, more or less. Some form of manual or electric blower. Now I have an electric blower here that's made specifically for use inside of a computer. That's not strictly necessary for this. All we need to do is get something that will blast air, that we can put this nozzle on a tube and get some semblance of airflow going into this tube to push air in and fluid out one of our drain ports. So I picked this one up because we have them lying around. They're static neutral and they have a dust filter, so when I'm done with this, we also have a great tool on standby to dust out our computer throughout the years. So a good thing to have around. If you don't want to buy something like this, or maybe you have something that's quasi-similar, like just some sort of an air pump lying around, or even a floor bellows pump that you'd use to inflate like a raft for a pool, or some sort of inflatable toy like that, one of those might work if you can just get the end of it into the fitting and start pressurizing air. But if you don't have anything, I'd probably recommend picking one of these up. 1, it'll get this job done really well, and 2, it's a great tool to have around for maintaining and dusting out your computer throughout the years. If interested, I'll put a few links to these in the video description below. First thing we'll want to do is take off both side panels on our Aventum 3. So just pull, that will come off. Same thing with the back panel. Next thing we're going to want to do is remove both of these plates. Let me give you a better angle so you can see what I am talking about. This and the one on the other side. We're going to want to remove those so we can get better access into the system. These have 4 Phillips head screws. So we'll just take our screwdriver and start working on these. Now I'd advise getting something to put these screws in. Let's see here. I have my handy dandy Digital Storm mug, so all of those little screws are going to go in there. I pretty much recommend if you have some little cups, shot glasses, anything you have lying around that you can put each different type of screw in. That will help later on when it comes to putting things back together. There's not a whole lot of screws, but still nice to keep track of them. See, when I remove this one, this is going to drop down. Should be okay. Just be advised when we take out this screw, this might, it didn't drop too much. Now we're going to want to hold this with our hand. And I usually just squeeze the two together. Keep screwing, and then just take the screw and the plate off at the same time. Makes it a lot easier to not drop the screw. And we'll just put our little screw in there. And we'll set these aside. We'll do the same thing for the other side. One. There's 2 layers of plastic here, the black and the white. Screw loves to get caught in between those sometimes, so that's always fun. There we go. And we'll take this and also set it aside. Just for future reference, there's no real difference between these sets on either side, they're the same piece, so if the left side goes back on the right or the right goes on the left, it doesn't matter. Okay, so now we have access to the hardware that we're going to need to get the block out. Swap this whole thing around. Take the 4 screws that I just took out. Put those in our little catch device there. So now we want to go ahead and open up our reservoir. Now, depending on your reservoir, this is going to be done one of 2 ways. If you have our current style reservoir, like shown here, there's going to be a little fill port at the top that we can either use our needle nose pliers or a Allen key. I don't know the size of the Allen key on that, so needle nose pliers might be your best bet. If your reservoir does not look like this one, you probably have one of our older units. These, the whole top will screw off of the reservoir. Now before you do that, go ahead and grab the reservoir tube with one hand, and then use your other hand to unscrew the top like this. If you don't brace the reservoir, there's a small chance that you could actually start unscrewing both the top and the reservoir tube from the base where the pump is. And if that happens, it's going to start dumping fluid out from the base of the reservoir, which is not good. If that somehow happens, just twist it tight again. It will lock back down. You shouldn't lose too much fluid, but still not a good thing to do. So just make sure you brace that when you pull the cap off. Since this one has our newer style of reservoir, and I don't quite know what the Allen key size is, the best thing to do is just take our tool here and wrap it in a little bit of masking tape. Now this can be done just to protect the finish on that little fill port. It's got a nice black paint job on it. We really don't want to scratch it. So let's grab some of this tape. There we go. Not pretty, but it will get the job done. So let me go around here and take this off. There we go. And once you get the top started, you can do the rest by hand once it's a little bit loose. There we go. There's our cap, and it is out. To start the draining process, there are 2 tubes that we need to remove. The lowest bottom tube here, then we'll skip one and go to the second one down from the top. So the second and the 4th tube, these are the 2 that we're going to want to disconnect so we can drain our system. Now before we do that, we want to grab some paper towel and just kind of put this more or less just sort of under the fitting. It should just drop, if anything, maybe a few drops of fluid. There's quick disconnects on here, so once you pull it out, it will seal itself. You won't have any problems with leaking. But the act of disconnecting it, a few drops might get out. So if you're concerned, just do what I'm doing right now. Place paper towel in the system. That way, if there's any drips that come down from here, it's just going to absorb in the paper towel. I mean, if you get this on the paint of the computer, no big deal. Just go ahead and wipe it up. It's not the end of the world. But still, always good to catch fluid when we can. So with that in there, let's go ahead and pull this fitting. Now, I have a fitting outside of the computer that I'll use here for demonstration purposes, just so you can see how this mechanism works. So you'll reach around, grab this collar right here, and then you will pull back, and then just pull apart. So now we'll get our hand in here. There's not a whole lot of room, but if you can just get 2 fingers in, and then squeeze that little collar like I demonstrated. So in, squeeze, pull back, and just remove it. There's a little bit of fluid, but that's about all you should see, and we can just let this hang down. So now what we're going to do is we're going to grab this little tube that we have earlier with our fitting and the tube segment. We're going to plug this into that connector, and this is going to start draining everything in our reservoir. So, and as soon as we connect this, it's going to start draining, so make sure that this is over your catch bucket. There we go. So that's going to get the reservoir clear. It's not going to get all the fluid out of our system. For that, we're going to have to do something else. But this is a good start. So now we've got this mostly drained. We're going to want to go to this second fitting that we talked about earlier and unplug that as well. This one's a little bit tighter with a bunch of stuff, but still, if you can just get back, grab the collar, pull, and same thing, just set this aside. Now we have another female fitting with a tube. We're going to want to plug this one in. Make sure it's pointed at the system, or at the bucket. Probably not a whole lot's going to come out of this one. What we want to do is take our little cap and cap off our reservoir. That's going to make sure that the only pressure that we have going through the system is going to go through these tubes. This is where our blower is going to come in handy. We need to use this to create pressure inside of the system to move fluid around where it can drain out this lower tube here. So what we do is we grab this, just put it roughly on the tube, cup it with your hand. So we use that to pressurize the system and blast a bunch of the fluid out. Now, before you do this, again, make sure that this is aimed at your bucket. Otherwise, you know, it's gonna go places you don't want it to, which is why in the beginning of this video I said take this to a workshop or a garage. But that should have gotten most of our fluid out. Let's go around and take a look at our block and see how much fluid, if any, we have left in it. Has gotten those two tubes completely clear of fluid. If you take a look here, these ones are more opaque. That's indicating that they are clear, whereas these ones, you can see the fluid is still in them. So now we're going to go on to the next segment where we do the same thing to these two fitting ports here. So now we're going to go over to this side and move these tubes over to here. Just going to unplug this one. Plug in our original fitting. Unplug the next fitting down. Now this is going to probably drain, so again, be ready. Okay, it didn't. Another thing too. We've got to take off our reservoir cap because now for this to drain, we might have a little bit of pressure in the system. We need to give that a little room to vent. Let's see if we can promote some of that fluid to leave. There we go, that's a start. Now we'll go ahead and remove this little port here. Plug in this tube again. Unplug our top tube, plug in our secondary female tube, it's now draining out of both. Woo! And we've got some paper towel on standby. You've noticed we've got a little bit of it on our case here. And I've got a little bit of it on my desk. Again, this is a good thing why you want to do this in a workshop or other space. That's just going to keep draining. We'll just wipe this up. The only thing that's on this door is a little dust filter and your fans behind it. The fluid isn't going to get anywhere meaningful. The dust filter and the panel is going to block that. At worst, it's just going to sit here and make these little fluid balls. So, just clean it up whenever. Not a big deal. So now I'm going to go into the back side of the computer and see what our block looks like. Because the whole point of this process is we need to get all the fluid out of the block so when we undo those fittings, there's no fluid that can go everywhere inside of our computer. Are looking good. Almost all the fluid is out. We've got a little bit right here. We can either try to go back to plugging that tube in and draining that little bit of fluid, or we can just deal with the fact that it's going to be there, put paper towel, and that's not a whole lot of fluid, so you can absorb that with paper towel just stuffed right here. But that's up to you. I might go and do one more pass just to see if I can get that out. Now we'll put that fill cap back in. Now that should pressurize the system. Let's see. Hold the tube up. We don't want this flowing fluid into our blower. So up. And just hit it real briefly. I'm giving it small blasts of air because now that there's no fluid inside of the pump, it's more of like a combination of mostly air with a bunch of fluid. I don't want to overspin the pump and possibly wear the bearings, so that's why I'm just giving it little blasts at a time to spin the pump up but not let it rev up to the moon. There we go. I'm going to lean this forward. Sometimes there's usually a little bit. Yep, there it is. Our block is looking nice and clear. Now there's a little bit of fluid in here, like you're going to see here, and little areas like that. That's not a problem. I mean, if that fluid does get to the little hole, it's going to leak out. But it's a small amount of fluid. It's just going to make a few drops. So that's where we just grab paper towel, put it down here when we go on to the next step, and any of these little bits of fluid that are in there aren't really going to make a big difference. The one thing we probably want to do is just take this computer and do this. Lean it. Yep, see, we got some extra fluid out of there. And that is draining into our bucket. Because this tube runs laterally across, so if we lean it backwards, we promote some fluid leaving it, and then we'll lean it forward. That's looking pretty good. As long as we don't go around moving this computer too much, we have a good amount of fluid out of the system, and we are pretty much ready to start removing our block. I've noticed we've got a little bit more fluid in here, so we might want to go back and blow out those first tubes again. We want to make sure this one is clear specifically, because when we undo this fitting, this fluid is going to go onto the floor. Now you can absorb that much with paper towel. I've absorbed about this much before, but that is actually a lot of fluid. So even this is probably okay, but the less paper towel you have to keep putting in and absorbing from this little leak point here, when we undo this, the happier you're going to be. Close up here, we look at the block. We can see that all the way up, it is pretty much dry. We've just got a little bit of fluid. That's fine. That's like a few drops. No worries there. This is just nice to get to this point, spend the extra time to drain the system properly, because when you remove this block, you're not going to be worried about removing fittings and trying to work with these for your first time and then having fluid come out, and it just adds a level of stress that is not super necessary. So if we just take our time, go back and forth, drain it properly the first time, then we set things up to have a nice leisurely extraction of this block later on. Excellent, we are good to go with removing the block. So the next and last thing we want to do in this phase is just take off these fittings and set them aside. Now that we have all of our fluid drained into our bucket, we can go ahead and set it aside for the time being. Before we set it aside, you want to cover something on top of this, just to make sure no dust or other debris get inside of and contaminate your fluid. I have an old keyboard box, but it's about the size of my little container here, so I'm just going to take this, set it on top, and move it aside. Now I'm going to rotate this around so you can all see the back side of the computer. So now we're onto the back side of our computer, and we are ready to start addressing this block. Now before we actually address any of the fittings, the first thing we need to do is get this LED strip out of this little groove. If we don't get this out, then when it comes time to take the block out, it's going to get stuck and we're going to have to deal with it then. So might as well deal with it right off the bat. Now this is held in place with a really good quality double-sided 3M sticky tape, at least at the time of making this video. That is great, has great holding power, but it also means that taking it off is going to be a little bit difficult. I'd recommend grabbing some sort of a flat piece of metal. I have a sponger here. You don't need a razor blade, that's sharp, that's going to cut into things, so nothing with a sharp edge. But if you have like a butter knife or a metal sponge or anything that's flat and strong, could be plastic, metal, doesn't matter too much. The most important thing is when we get onto this, we just want to be careful with the LED strip. Now, as we remove this foam and we get our tool in and we start working it through these edges like so, you're going to notice that this 3M sticky tape is going to kind of bunch up. It's going to get to the point where it's going to want to ball up, and you're just going to have to pull it out. To be honest, the 3M sticky tape, it's in here. It's very unlikely you're going to actually reuse that part of it on this LED strip. You may have to go out to the store once we're done and get new sticky tape. Honestly, you could probably just take off this 3M sticky tape, and any of the residue that's on the back of the LED strip will probably be sufficient to hold it onto this block, because with this channel here, the LED strip is being led into here and being pushed down with gravity, and it's held on both sides with this channel. So it's not like you need a lot of holding power on the block to keep that LED strip in place. So don't be alarmed if when we go through, you're going to have to remove this 3M stuff. That's just going to be part of this process. But yeah, now let's go into actually getting our tool in here and removing this. So if we take our sponger and start working at one of these edges, we'll be able to get under it and start peeling up some of this 3M sticky tape. Now, I've done this once before as a trial run, so mine is already a little bit easier to remove. Yours is definitely going to be difficult. This took me a little while to get this off, but just slow and steady is the name of the game. So we'll get our sponger in here and just start working to get... Ooh. See, another reason why you don't want to have something sharp, if this was sharp, that would have cut my hand, but because it's a sponger, it's not. And we're also not damaging the LED strip or scratching up our block. Now this block is, yours is cracked, it's going to be complete trash, but still, I don't know, maybe you want to make some cool doorstop out of this. Whatever. So we'll go, get a nice steady grip on this and just work our way down. Because I've already done this once, this is not really fighting me that much. So I go down here. Here's what I was talking about earlier, where it kind of balls up and gets kind of gummed up. This is just going to happen. When this happens, it's useless. Go ahead, remove it. And just keep working your way down. Once you've kind of gone along the whole thing and kind of gotten it loosened, go back up to the top and then start working. See, I've got here where it's balled up and now it's stuck sideways. So I just have to get in there, pull this big glob. Now I can get the strip out and just keep working. Move you down until it comes loose. Now mine came loose pretty easily because, again, I've done this before on this system. Yours is probably not going to come loose. You're going to have to, just like this little piece up here, you're going to have to just work at this. You can see all the places that it's fought me before where I don't have any tape here. Pretty much my entire bottom section of the strip here, the tape came off and I just peeled it off like this. And let's see, let me go up here. That's probably just the best thing to do, is take this stuff, pull it off, get the stuff off the bottom. Because at least with this nice and smooth, when it comes time to put it back in, we can line it up, put it in, take our tool, press it flat. And as you see, this is sticking pretty nicely right here. This looks pretty clean as I'm going down. So even though we've removed that 3M tape, it doesn't take much to keep it on here. But when you're putting this on later, like if you notice this is lifted a little bit here, you can always just grab any sort of 3M or any sort of double-sided sticky tape and just use that to reapply a thin layer of this, and that will hold perfectly fine. But in this case, let's go ahead and pull this out. One thing to bear in mind when you are pulling this out, at some points it will be free, maybe it'll be free up to here, but maybe this part right here will be stuck, and you'll pull, and see how this is starting to kink right here? If you kink this too much, it will actually break these little contact points, because there's little microcontrollers in here. These are individually addressable LEDs. So if you break one of these connection points or one of the microcontrollers, the whole strip from that point on is either going to be discolored or it's not going to work at all. So you really don't want to twist this sideways too much. It can bend, forward and back like this, but it can't really take a lot of sideways stress. So don't grab this and start wrenching it out where it starts bending like this sideways. If that's the case, just go slow, get your tool in there, and work it through. And again, if you have to pull this stuff out and it balls up, just go ahead and do it. You're probably not going to reuse it anyways. And then just go nice and slow to get this out. Now once this is out, we can just go ahead and set it off to the side here. So now we are ready to get to our actual fittings on the block. This is where we can grab our needle nose pliers. Here's the pair that I have earlier, and just for comparison, here is a smaller pair. These will barely work. I don't recommend something like this. If you have something like this, get one more of this size range. It's going to give you better leverage and overall fitment across those fittings. Now, I have these wrapped in tape like before, and that's just to protect the finish on the fittings as much as possible. The less scratches, the better. If you scratch up some of the silver fittings, it's just silver behind them. You really won't notice that much. But if you have gold or black or white fittings or any other fittings that have paint on them, then it's something that you might notice more severely. So just be sure, if you're worried about any scratches, that you just wrap some tape. Electrical tape does work pretty well, or just a few layers of masking tape. As you go through and you really want to protect this, you may want to wrap a few layers of tape around this, or have to rewrap it during the process. But for the most part, just a few layers of tape will protect it. If it slides a little bit in the fitting, not the end of the world. These will take a bit of force to get moving. So yeah, with that covered, let's go on to our first fitting. Now, the first fittings we're going to deal with are the ones up top. We're going to do these two right here, and then we're going to do the two on the bottom. And the first thing we want to start with, I'm going to start with this fitting right here on the left. And what we want to do is we want to take this top fitting collar right here, the one that's closest to this top block, right, let's see if I can get you a good indicator, right here. We want to take our tool, grab that, squeeze down hard, turn to the left, toward the back of the computer. That is going to start backing this fitting out. So we'll just start doing that. Now our next fitting, you've noticed we try to get our tool in here, and this stupid thing is in the way. This is what holds on the Digital Storm logo bracket. So let's go ahead and just remove this. There's two Phillips head screws up on top. So let me get my screwdriver and we'll pop this out just so it's out of the way. Just a thin screwdriver. There are two screws at the top here. Now, these screws from the factory are in pretty tight. So you'll want to get a nice sharp screwdriver, and you're probably going to have to press into the system with a good amount of weight and turn to get them to unlock from the chassis. I've already done this before, so it shouldn't be too bad. Just push, turn. Once you overcome that first initial push, the rest of it should go quickly. Grab this. There. Now we don't have to worry about that. We have much better access to this fitting. Always better if something's in the way just to get it out of the way. So we started on this fitting. Let's go ahead and start on this fitting here. Same thing. Grab, tight, twist. Now we did get all of our fluid out. It is definitely something to have good on standby, your paper towel. So before we get this too far out, it's good to have a little bit of paper towel on standby, just kind of sitting around. In fact, let's go ahead and just paper towel up the whole system just to kind of get stuff in to protect it. So down here along the bottom, there's pretty much not too much to worry about if fluid gets down here, except for this hole here. This hole is where all the cables for the power supply go, and that is the one place that we definitely do not want to get fluid. So just take paper towel, preemptively put it along here, make sure it runs along underneath this cable bundle along the length of the bottom. Just cram it in there nice and good. We'll grab a little bit more. Bundle this up. And just place this down here. That way, if we have any major leaks, then we're not going to get fluid somewhere it doesn't belong. Most of these cables are sealed, they're rubber all the way through, so if a little water gets on them, they're fine, they're pretty much already covered. Maybe we'll grab a little bit and just cover up this connector here. But down here is your major point of worry. You just want to make sure that this is well covered. For the most part, if fluid leaks out, it's just going to kind of pool and puddle on this base. There's nothing really below this other than radiators and fans. The fans are pretty well protected by this shroud here, so there's not really many places for the fluid to go. It'll just kind of sit there, and if it does go somewhere, it's just going to get on a radiator, which isn't going to hurt it. But yeah, just nice to have this in place before we start. And I'd probably grab a little bit more paper towel. Just have it on standby. Now, we've done a proper job of draining beforehand, so this shouldn't be super necessary, but just, it's always good to make sure you are ready for some sort of like a disaster scenario and then be super happy when you don't need it. We've been pretty diligent, so we should be good with this build. So now let's take our tool here and continue working on these fittings. So we'll just keep backing this out. And do the next one. So as you can see, as we are backing these fittings out, we are actually getting more and more thread showing up here. This is starting to back out of our block. Now sometimes this gets a little bit loose where I can kind of spin it with my finger for a few short turns. Just grab it, keep going. Back to the next one. I'm getting a little bit of tape off of these, so I'm going to retape this real quick. There we go. See a good amount of threading here. And there. Now I just saw the block kind of pop a little bit, so this is actually free of this. Now we can go on to our bottom. Now before we start loosening these, just make sure again you have more paper towel on standby. These are the two that if there's any fluid in here that we can't see, it's probably going to leak a little bit. Now if that happens, no worries, just grab your paper towel and absorb it. So these fittings, we're actually going to do the exact opposite of what we did up here. So instead of the topmost, we're going to grab the bottommost fitting. Not the nut below the fitting, but just the fitting itself. And we're going to turn this the opposite direction. So we're going to turn it this way toward the front of the computer. So again, grab your tool, put this in here, grab that bottom one, make sure you don't grab the nut below it, and just start loosening. Loosen that one. Loosen this one. Make sure the LED strip runs right behind this. So if you need to move the LED strip out of the way, go ahead and do that. Just make sure you don't pinch the cable for the LED strip while you're using your pliers. These are loose. Sometimes you can actually spin these with your hand, and it's a little bit easier. These are compression fittings, so as they spin out, they'll kind of compress themselves. And yeah, the bottom ones usually are a little bit easier than the top ones. So we haven't got to a point where there's a leak yet, but sometimes once these pop out of the bottom, you do see some fluid spill out. We've been pretty diligent with our draining, so if that does happen, there shouldn't be a whole lot. Just keep going. Sometimes they'll come loose and you're just kind of uselessly spinning it because you've already got it out. But just spin it. If it's that case, just kind of spin it until you get to the point where it feels like you're kind of being ridiculous. See, let's get my eye in there. It looks like I'm now just spinning freely on these. So these fittings are undone, these are undone. The next group of fittings that we need to get to are actually these fittings here, 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 and here that go onto the other side of the computer and connect our quick disconnects. we have to remove these. They're not super hard to get removed. They shouldn't take too terribly long. And this is where, once again, our handy-dandy needle-nose pliers are going to come in handy. Now, if you've noticed earlier, I mentioned wrapping this tape around the base. I'm going to rewrap this on mine. This is to protect your paint on your computer, because you're going to take these needle-nose pliers, put them sideways between this metal plate and this block, and they're going to be pivoting like this. If you don't have tape on here, this is going to scratch the paint, and it's going to look really ugly, and it's going to suck. So just wrap this with tape. I'm going to rewrap this so it's a little bit better, and then move back on to getting this removed. There we go. Our tool looks ridiculous, but this is going to protect our paint and make it so we don't have to worry about that when we're moving our hands around. So now what we want to do is we want to take this and put it in here. Make sure these don't catch on these little metal brackets here. Take this in and clamp it onto the collar. Pretty much you want to get this as close to the block as possible. There's about enough room, so if you get this in here, it's going to clamp exactly where it needs to. Better angle so you can see this. So there is my tool. You can see that it is clamped onto that fitting. So we're just going to take this and go up. And as you see, that rotated, it started loosening this. It doesn't take much. See, now that it's free to rotate, I don't have to worry about that. I can stop and move on to the next fitting. Because the rest we can back out with our hand. So we'll get in here, loosen, that's good. And the direction that we're moving on this, we are moving up toward the top of the case. Crimp, push, give it a few good rotations. That's good. The bottom one is the most difficult. It's the one that usually gives me the most crap. There's the least amount of room, and it likes to fight me. See, usually when I get to the bottom one, at least with these tools, maybe your tool is a little bit thinner, adding the tape. In fact, I'm at a point now where I've overdone on tape. So I'm going to remove the tape on the top. Your tool might be a little bit different, but I have a lot of tape on here. So I need to make this a little thinner. Because right now, it seems like it's fighting me. There we go. Some of the tape is peeled back, but it's still all well protected on our back. And you can see where it's already started to brush up a little bit on the paint. That's just some of the dust that's coming off from when the paint job was originally made. But that tells you that this is making contact with the paint on the back of the system. So taking precaution definitely helps to protect your investment. Now we'll get in here if this wants to play along. There we go. Just barely touching this one. It's moving along. Get one more pull. And that probably is loose. A little bit of tape. There we go. So it doesn't actually take but a few turns to get these loose. Once they are loose, we can go to the other side and just unscrew them by hand. Let's start with that bottom fitting that was giving us some grief. Yep, so we turn it toward the front of the computer. Just spin it. Take it off, take it straight out and back. These might have fluid in them. You can see there's a little bit of fluid that came out. So when you do take these out, make sure to take them straight out. Don't dump them down where they might get fluid on stuff. I mean, that's why we have our paper towel. There we go. Set that aside. This one's always the most difficult because it's right next to the SATA cable loom. Your wiring might be a little bit different. This is sort of specific to this motherboard, so one of yours might be the most difficult one that's not this one. There's that one. And yes. So there are all 4 of our fittings out. Now, if you're wondering, these are not specific to any one hole. They're all identical to each other. So when it comes to putting these back in later on, any of these can go anywhere. But yeah, there you can see our holes are completely clear. You can see the block through to the other side. Now, the only thing holding this on is a few Phillips head screws. So once again, we'll grab our Phillips head screwdriver, put this in here. We'll start, doesn't really matter which one you start with. I started with the bottom one because that's what I decided to. Let's pull that out. Set it aside. All of these screws are identical, so you don't have to worry about putting each screw back in any specific place or order. There we go. I think there's a screw in there. Yes, there is. And let's see, our last screw. And I can already feel this last screw as soon as I pulled this out, the block started shifting a little bit. It released pressure, telling me that this is ready to come out. Now we can double check to see if it's ready to come out by just gently pushing up on this top block here. I can see that these two are moving separately. They're not connected anymore. And if I move up on the bottom here, I can see that these are not connected anymore. If any one of these are still connected, then just keep turning them, the top ones this way, the bottom ones this way, until that is separated. But we are ready to take this out. Now, one thing I'd recommend doing to make sure that you don't scratch the case, grab some tape, take a strip about this long, and right down here next to, right in front of our block, just put a strip of tape here, because we're going to pop this block up, and when it moves over, it might rest down on this metal. That way we protect it and it doesn't get scratched. So let's lift up, out. Now the bottom is going to pop down. Move our top up a little bit. Grab this. There we go. Our block is now out of the system. Now I have my hand on the bottom of this to prevent fluid from coming out the bottom ports, but also there might be a little bit of fluid in these pathways here. So angle it forward, because we have, you can see, these 4 holes on the bottom. And the first time that I pulled this out, it went boot and it dumped fluid on my floor. It's clear, so no big deal. I have industrial carpet below this, but again, it's less stuff for you to clean up, especially if you have colored fluids. But this now gets us to a point where our block is fully removed from the computer. We can now start taking the fittings off of this unit, put them on your replacement unit, and get everything ready to get the new block installed into your computer. Sorry about the continuity jump here. It's come to my attention after I created this video that some of our customers have experienced cracking on this small lateral block. It's much less common, but still it's something that I do want to address. I have my computer kind of completely put back together, but thankfully it's something I can show you really easily how to remove this piece. So at the point in the video where this segment comes in, you should have the block removed and all the fluid drained from the system. This should just be hanging by only these 2 fittings here. Now what we can do is, I would recommend putting a little bit of paper towel or just something underneath these fittings on the back, these ones where the block plugged in. Just do that so any fluid doesn't leak out. Take the system, just bend it back and forth. Just a few times, angle it just to see if there's any fluid in this radiator that is there, because when we move the block, the fluid's going to go boom, straight down. So as long as you do that, you should be fine. If you're really concerned about it, just take a towel, paper towel. I got a microfiber here. Just lay it on top of your reservoir. That way, if there is any leak here, just push this all the way to the back. That way, if this does leak, it's not a big deal. From what we did earlier, there's probably very little fluid left in the system, if really any meaningful amount at all. But to remove this, all we need to do is grab our needle nose pliers And right here, this fitting that is connecting to the actual acrylic block itself, we will grab that and pull it in toward the inside of the computer. Or grab it from the side and pull it toward the back of the computer. It goes this direction. So I have a sample block in my hand here. So I'll grab a fitting, get that free, do the next one. And on your system, you're going to want to work these a little bit at a time, so it kind of drops the block incrementally. It doesn't skew the block at some weird angle. But just keep doing that until you get to a point where the block will come out. These fittings will just spin. They're on a little sleeve collar, so they will just spin until they spin out of the block. So now all you need to do is take your trash block, set it aside. Here is our replacement block, and just line it up and do the reverse. You can probably start finger tightening these. Just grab your fittings that are up here and start threading them in. And then just grab your needle nose pliers and go back and forth until they are nice and tight with this top block, and it looks just like this again. Now when you're tightening these down to the block, they need to be tight, but you're tightening metal to acrylic. So this doesn't need to be crazy tight. I mean, if you really, really want it, you can break this. So just tighten this to the point where it's becoming difficult. Like it's going fine, going fine. Ah, now it's starting to fight me. That's tight enough, because all we need to do is just seal the metal to the plastic and then squish the O-ring inside. That's sufficient to prevent things. And you can check, if you cannot spin that at all with your fingers, then it is probably on tight enough. But that's all you need to do to replace that top block. Oh, sorry once again for the slight continuity jump, but now back to the rest of the video. So the first thing we need to do is get our fittings out of our old block. Now to do this, we simply take our needle nose pliers, and if you look at this little piece of metal that runs right up against the block, that is what we are going to grab. So grab that with your needle nose pliers. Get a good grip on there. You might grab the collar above it too. If you can grab both at the same time, that's fine. And we're going to turn this toward these little holes. So this way toward these 4 holes. Once you get it started, you can just pull it out with your hand. We'll do the next one. There we go. Just takes a little bit of effort. On the bottom ones, these are going to go away from the holes for turning them. So just grab. Let's see, let me move this out. These can slide, so if you find that you're grabbing this but not this piece, just slide this out of the way. There we go. Do the next one. Okay, so now we can take our old damaged block and just set it aside to do whatever you want to do with it. And now we will go ahead and grab our replacement block and start threading these fittings back onto this block. Now when you take these fittings, pay attention to the fact that there's that very thin collar. There's 3 different sections. So if we look here, let me pull this out just so you can get a... See how this one is the thinnest right here? That thin side is the one that's going to go up against the block. So go ahead and just tighten it on by hand. Grab our pliers. And make sure this is on nice and tight. You want this pretty tight. You don't want to over tighten it where like you're bending and your muscles are flexing, but you want to have a good amount of pressure on this because this is going to be a component that is sealing. So again, there's a fine line between too much pressure and not enough, but if it's at the point where you're starting to like bend your muscles like this and really, really fight it, it's probably on tight enough at that point. You don't really want to go any farther. So we'll do our next fitting. There we go. There we go. Right when my muscle's starting to go like this a little bit, that was enough. So we'll do our next one. Again, making sure that we are putting the thin collar on first. It seems like it's a little bit easier just to slide this out so we can actually get to the collar. There we go. Fitting. So this new block is now prepared and ready to go back into our Aventum 3. So now that we have our block, the first thing we want to do before we start putting it back into the computer is take a look at our little fittings. Now we moved these out earlier so we could get some of these fittings on. Now we want to go ahead and push on these and slide them all down so the block is as thin as possible. Because when we put this block on the computer, it's not just going to plug in and sit. We're actually going to have to kind of move it around a little bit and line it up so this fits perfectly with these holes. Oh, one last thing before we put this back in. We've had our hands all over this and a bunch of fluid and things. The block probably has a bunch of fingerprints. Maybe even our computer has some fingerprints or things on it. So let's just take a towel and quickly wipe this down and make it look nice and pretty so we can put it back in the system. It's quite difficult to get to the back side of this block once it is in. It's not impossible, but difficult. So let's just make this clean while we have good access to it. And if there's any dust, there's a little bit of dust that's just settled back here. I'll just clean this up. There we go. My block is looking nice and clean. LED strip, it's kind of floating around, moving. It's kind of annoying. Make sure that it is not behind this wire bundle. It's sitting in front of that bundle, but the wire for this is behind these fitting ports, because we don't want to get this stuck back here where it's jammed, and we don't want to put the block on top of this and crimp the cable. So just like this, kind of out of the way, and that will be fine. So now what we want to do is we want to take our block, hook the bottom edge underneath this lip. This is where we have the tape, so if it needs, just set it down briefly on the floor of the system. Gently lift up our top block until these holes line up here. Now lift up the top and slide this into those holes where it originally came from. So this is back in place. You can see that our LED strip is not kinked or pushed back somewhere where it's difficult to get to. It will fit where it belongs inside of this little area. We'll deal with this later because this is not super important right now, but at least our LED strip is somewhere where if we tighten everything down, we know this will fit. It's not kinked or stuck back here where we'd have to take the block off again. That would suck. So you can start these fittings with your hand. Thing to be aware of when you're tightening these, you tighten toward the front to tighten them. So I'm turning them toward the front of the computer for the top. You might have to push down on the top block and connect it to the fitting so the two actually start threading. If you just notice that you're spinning this uselessly, just push the two together. It should bite and it should start threading in. Now the bottom ones are going to be turned toward that way, toward the back of the computer. And hand tightening is fine for now. This one's a little bit tighter, so I'm going to grab my tool. It's not guaranteed you'll be able to hand tighten, but usually you can do most of them by hand. As I tighten this, it gets nice and set up. There we go. Now, with these tight, let's go ahead and actually properly tighten them. There's this one. Similar tightness to what we did on the block. We don't want to wrench on these and over-tighten them, but you do want to tighten them nice and firm, because if these are loose, they will leak fluid. Once you get to the point where it's really starting to give you resistance, that's tight enough. That is good. Oh, now we will do our top. There we are. There we are. Good. I'm going to do this one more turn, just make sure. So grab tightly, twist. Yep, that's fighting me, that's tight enough. That's tight enough. Good, so these are connected. Let's double check our bottom ones just to make sure they're good. Grab tightly, squeeze. Yep, grab tightly, squeeze. Oh, these could be just a hair tighter. Let's see. Okay, those are good. So now we're at a point where our block is in, but it's not really anchored to anything. The reason we use these compression fittings is that it can kind of move up and down a little bit. So we're going to have to align these 4 holes here back again with the 4 holes that are on the other side of our system. So we're just going to have it grab your block, and you can move it up and down. Just get your eye in there. Let's see. So we're low. Push up on that. And great. And when I let go, it resettles the block. But we have an idea now what we need to do. So let's grab our first screw. We'll go ahead and let's just put it in this middle one right here. So get your eyeball in there. Lift it up. Find our screw hole. Use my chin to hold that in there. Let's see. Line it up. And there's our first screw in. I'm eyeballing these. These look okay. Let's just take our screw and just make sure it's tightening. Now, that should be good enough for now just to hold this. Let's go on to the other side of the computer, grab our little fitting ports, and see if they can thread through and bolt up here. If they do, we'll be good to tighten down the rest of the block. So I've got my 4 little fitting ports here, and if we look, these look pretty well lined up, but the true test is, will these fit? So let's grab one of these, put it in, finger tighten it. Yep, that's looking good. This one is, on this computer, is always the most difficult because it's right between where all the SATA cable bundles go. But these are going in so far nicely. We got one more to thread in. Let's just make sure that it fits. See, so now we want to put these in and just get them finger tight. But the tighter we can get them by finger, if we can get these to the point where they're pretty on there, then the tighter these are, the less we're going to have to use our tools. There we go. All of our fittings are back in. They're just finger tightened. If for whatever reason you feel that you want to move the block up or down, maybe you're a little OCD or maybe you just want this to feel a little bit cleaner, then you can still go on the backside, loosen that screw and just adjust it up and down and then tighten the screw back down. But with these in, everything will fit perfectly fine. So let's go on to the other side of our computer. So now our block is where we want it to go. Let's go ahead and put in the rest of these screws. Let's go ahead and put in the rest of these screws. Make sure our block doesn't move around. Line that up, put that in there. Don't over tighten these screws. They are metal on acrylic. So if you rain down on these with unrelenting force, you could possibly crack the block. They don't have to be in there super hard. There's enough of them to just spread load across and hold the block. So just firm, you know, where it starts giving you resistance, but you really don't want to over tighten these. See, I'm using a small screwdriver, and once that starts fighting me to the point where I'm having a problem, that's actually enough with this little thing. See, we've got 5 screws, so 3 down, 2 more to go. Aha. And our last screw. Okay, so now our block is held in place. There's a few more things we need to do to get this block ready to accept fluid. The first thing we want to do is go and check these middle collars here. So we've got our upper ones tightened and our lower ones we tightened into the block earlier, but we haven't really addressed the collars. So what we want to do with these, if I put my hand on this one, it's a little bit loose. We want to make sure that these are at least tight. They don't have to be crazy tight, but we do want to double check these and make sure they didn't get loosened during any of the previous segments. So this one, I can loosen it and tighten it with my hand. That's not good. That could create a leak. So we'll just take this and turn it toward the front of the computer for the top one. That's tight enough. These you don't want to rain down on because there is a little rubber washer in it, and if we wrench the ever-living heck out of them, then you could actually kind of pinch that washer inside. So we just want to have these tight enough to where they make a snug fitting. That one was a little loose. There we go. Now these back ones go toward the back of the computer. That one's tight. That one is tight. Okay, so these are now connected. These are nice and firm. These are nice and firm. So our block more or less is in. These connection points are done. They should be good to go. Now before we went up, so now we want to grab this and go down. We'll start with our first one. Also, if this cable loom is in your way, it's driving you nuts, you can go ahead and disconnect it. There are 4 points. Just pay attention to what went where before you disconnect it. Maybe take a photo with your cell phone so you have reference. But I have 4 cables here. Now it's out of my way. So you put this in nice and flat. Get a grip and tighten that. We don't want to over tighten this because this is metal going into acrylic. So we want to be a little bit gentle. Pretty much when you get to the point where you can't get enough force and it's starting to slide or it's starting to really fight you, that's probably tight enough. That means that the metal has tightened up to the acrylic to the point where it's pinching the O-ring. And we don't really want to go any tighter. Let me just double check this. I have a feeling I can get just a little bit more out of this one. Okay, that's slipping, so we should be good. That's not allowing me to tighten it anymore. We're going to our second one. Get a good grip on that. Okay, I'm going to double check my first one again now that I've done another fitting. See, got a little bit more movement out of that one. That one's good. On to our third fitting. go. I think this one's good. Let's just make sure. That one is done. And our last one, and the most difficult one, of course, like most things, it's always the last one that is difficult. I think it's in there. This one takes the longest because the amount of time that I can move on this system, the amount that it moves per rotation is very little. Okay. Try for one more, and I think we're good. This part sucks. Yep. So that is tight. That is taken care of in there. So these are taken care of. All of our screws are in, our fittings here are in, these are in. This system theoretically should be ready to go. So let's take these power cables, plug them back in. So the block is now in. We could deal with our LED strip right now. I don't want to deal with this just yet because there's any leaks or anything and we might have to move or adjust things. Having this kind of floating here is kind of good. It gives us more room to kind of get in and work. So this will be sort of our last thing that we'll fix at the very end. For right now, we'll just leave it aside. So let's go on to the other side of our computer and start plugging in all of our quick disconnects. So we'll just start plugging these in. Take one, plug it in, two, three, four. So our liquid cooling system is now back together, and we're at the point where we can remove the cap on our reservoir and start adding fluid back to the system. Now, before you start adding fluid, it's probably best just to double check if you felt like you rushed any step or you're not quite sure about a fitting. If you have any doubts whatsoever, now is the time just to check, look over the system, make sure everything is connected, because when we add fluid, this is the potential that we're going to get for any major leaks inside of our system. Now, if we're diligent, we tighten things down nicely, we shouldn't have any problems. This is definitely a time where you want to have a lot of paper towel on standby, just in case. Now, we're not going to load up all the fluid in the system. We're going to put a little bit, turn it on, turn it off, let the pump suck down the fluid, and then cycle that a few times and pay close attention to the block, both the 4 fittings that we put on and the 4 fittings at the top and the bottom. Those 8 points are going to be our potentials for leaks. So as we turn the system on, we're going to be monitoring those, see if there's any large or small little trickle leaks, and we can turn the system off as soon as we notice one of them and address them. Before we turn on our computer for the first time, there's one thing I want to go over, and that is your hard drives. Now, when we're booting this computer, it's going to suck the fluids down on the reservoir, and before this gets dry, we are going to want to turn off the system so the pump doesn't spin without any fluid. As we're going to have to turn this on and off probably about maybe half a dozen times to kind of fill this, drain it, fill this, drain it. There's a lot of fluid in this bucket that's going to need to go back into the system. And if there's any sort of a leak or something where you have to turn the computer off immediately or turn it off to prevent this pump from spinning dry, we're going to need to do that at that second, not wait for anything. Which means the computer might be in the middle of booting Windows when we turn it off, and that could cause Windows corruption. It could break your ability to load into Windows. So there are 2 solutions we can do to avoid this. One is just locating your OS drive and just pulling it out of the system. Pull the OS drive out of the system. It can't boot to it. It can't corrupt it. It's no longer part of the equation. In this system, I have one of the little M.2s. Those are usually on a motherboard, either the front or the back of the motherboard. So we'd have to take out these 2 video cards and just pull this little slot out here. If you have a solid state drive or just a hard drive for your boot You have an Aventum 3, so you're probably going to have a solid state drive for your boot drive. Solid states and hard drives are in these 8 bays here. So if you're not sure which one it is, you can just pull them all out. Just make sure they go back in the same place. So if you're going to pull these out, I'd recommend grabbing some masking tape and just write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, whatever drives you have in there, and label them, because we'll want to put them back in the same place later on. Now to remove these, there's a little tab here. You just push up on that tab until it locks and pull forward. The drive will come out, we can set it aside, and again, that way we're not booting into a system where we can potentially corrupt Windows. We might have to go back later on and just reset up some of the boot order if things got a little bit messed up, but that's very easy. That takes less than a minute to go through and configure. That's something that if you're having issues, I can't go over that in this video because there's like a million different motherboards we sell, and there's no one way I can tell you to go through that. But if you have boot order issues, just go ahead and call our support staff. They'll be able to look at exactly what make and model you have and give you the appropriate assistance for that hardware. Now, one thing to note, if you have a RAID array, where you either have redundancy across multiple disks, or you have them stacked together in stripe so they run faster, if you have that style of setup, probably don't do this, because you could destabilize the RAID. The computer will the computer will boot up. It will look for that hardware. When it can't find the hardware, it'll lose its mind, and when you put the drives back in, it might actually break that RAID. If you have a RAID, I'd probably advise against pulling the drives out, because that could destabilize the RAID. And if that's the case, we'll go on to option number 2. Now, option number 2 is to power isolate our main board. Now, that's what I'm going to be doing here, because this motherboard is actually non-functional. This is one of our test sleds that needed repair, and that's why I grabbed it to do this tutorial on. And that's going to require us to unplug all of the power cables from the motherboard and from the video cards. With that done, we can then jump the power supply, power on the power supply and only the peripherals connected, but without any processor or any rest of the computer. There's nothing that can communicate with your hard drives or any of your data and cause corruption. We'll just be turning it on, spinning our pump, turning it off. So it'll keep our data safe and protected until we're done and we can power the system back on for good. Now, to cover this, I can't go over every single motherboard and every single configuration. We sell dozens of motherboards, and they change with every new update cycle. So your system most likely is going to be different, probably very different than the system in front of me. But there are several basic connectors you can look for, and there should only be so many of each connector on each board. Now, this system's a little bit special. This is a dual Xeon. This is a pretty high-end workstation configuration. But still, the cables that we're going to look for are usually along these bottom edges here or here. Possibly along these, pretty much around the edges of the board is where we're looking. We're going to look for these types of cables. First off is our 24-pin connector. This is the large one, looks just like this. Yours might be different mesh wrap cable colors. It might just be bundled mesh wrapped, like a tube of cables. But you'll see this large connector with 12 pins on each side that is a rectangle. That is our motherboard's main power. Next up is going to be a 8-pin power. This is usually for powering our CPU. Because I have 2 CPUs on this system, we actually have 2 of them to unplug, one under each CPU. Usually these are situated somewhere around either on this side or on this side of your CPUs. Now, because this is a Xeon, I have another 6-pin connector up here, along with these connectors that go to our graphics cards. Now, I could do one of 2 things. I could either unplug all of these from this end, or I could unplug them from the circuit board on the back, like we did earlier when we moved those cables out of the way to tighten our block. So, all here I have 4 cables. They run up to this connector. So on the other side of the system, I've just disconnected these from there because it was easier to get to. Now, there are 2 additional cable types that you might find on your system. Some boards have them, some don't. And that is going to be most likely a 4-pin Molex connector. These are those old style ones you used to see on old hard drives and you still see on certain pumps and things. I hate these, but they are still around. So usually that is going to be on this top edge of the board right around here. Almost exclusively, I find them somewhere in this area. That's not 100%, but usually it's up here. So just look around the edges of your board, look for a connector that looks like this. If you see one, unplug it. That also might be a SATA connector like you see in your hard drives. So if you see a connector that looks like this plugged into your main board, go ahead and unplug that as well. So earlier we talked about the paper clip or this little jump connector for the power supply. We're at that point now, we're ready to start jumping the supply. So I'm going to show you how to use both of these tools. First up is our 24-pin jump connector. All you need to do is line up the clip here on the 24-pin connector with the clip on the top of this, match two together, and plug this in. Now before you plug this in, if your computer is plugged in and powered on, the second you plug this in, the system is going to turn on. So if you don't want that to happen, or you're not ready for that to happen, make sure the power supply is switched off, or just have the computer unplugged. But all you need to do is grab this cable, grab this connector, line up the little connector clips, and just clink, and it plugs together. That is all you need to do. Now onto the paper clip. Now the paper clip isn't much more difficult, but as I said before, it's a little bit sketchy. We're going to have to take this clip and bend it in a way where it fits into two of these pins. I definitely advise doing this with the computer unplugged. That is definitely the best practice, just in case this goes into the wrong pin. It's not going to cause any problems. So now we want to address how to do this with our paper clip. We have our 24-pin connector here. First off, make sure the computer is unplugged. So we want to take this connector and orient it like such, so the long flat side with the clip is on the top. From there, go to the top left edge and find this top connector on the left. Now we'll go in 1, 2, 3, 4. We want to bridge pins 3 and 4 here together. So we take our paper clip, I've bent it like such. Usually good if it's kind of bent at a V where they're pushing into each other like this. That way it holds pressure and it keeps itself into the connector. So now we're going to go ahead and find our connector. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here's 3 and 4 on the top row. Take your paper clip, plug it in there, make sure it's inside of the connector. It should fit nice and snugly like that. Now, double check, just verify that you're in the correct space. We are here. So I can take this and gently set it aside somewhere where it's not going to touch the side of our case. I just use this little groove here. Maybe your cable is in a different position, but this works well for me. I can kind of hang it there, and it holds itself, and there's plenty of room around this. It's not touching the case. We are good to go. So as soon as we plug in this computer and power on the power switch, this system will come alive. Before you plug in the system, go around this motherboard once again. Make sure that everything is unpowered. The connectors that I just talked about are unplugged from the motherboard and either from the graphics cards on this side or on the back side of the system. If everything looks okay, you are now ready to fire up the computer for the first time. Now there's two things we want to watch when we fire up the computer. One is we want to be cognizant of this fluid level here. We don't want this to drop and then start spinning super hard. Again, if the pump spins a little bit, it's not the end of the world. But if this runs for an extended period of time, 15 or 20 or 30 seconds with air in it, you are going to burn this pump out and we're going to be in another situation that is going to require a more involved repair. You don't want to be in that spot. So I've brought my fluid back and I have my little bottle here that we used earlier to get fluid out of the system. Now this is giving me a little bit of grief, so I just taped this tube to the bottle because this started getting loose and coming out. So if you have that problem, just tape it. So I already have my reservoir cap off. So all we need to do is grab this, squeeze it, put the end in the fluid, angle it down, and just let it start sucking up fluid. See, when you pull this out of your bucket, make sure you don't have a bunch of fluid still in the line, kind of burp the bottle a little bit. So, because sometimes you pull this out and it'll drain fluid onto your desk or inside of your computer. So make sure that, yep, your tube is clear before you pull it out. So now we just insert this end into our reservoir, take our bottle, and invert it. So before we plug in our computer, let's just make sure we have lots of paper towel on standby. Now I have my whole roll here. I've got some in my hand. I've got a bunch of it sitting on the table that I can grab if there's some sort of a large leak. This is the place you want to be prepared because if there's going to be a large leak, this is going to be the time. What we're going to do is we're going to plug this in, power it on, let that fluid drain through this system, and check for any leaks. So we're pretty much ready to do that. Let's go ahead and make sure our power supply is switched to the O, 0 or off position. If it is, go ahead and plug this in. I found that I like to be on the backside monitoring the block and looking for any leaks, but what I would recommend is get around here, either have a friend or someone with you that tells you, okay, it's getting low, power it off, or there's a few little holes you can actually look through back here and see the fluid level. So just flip the system on, it should power on. Go ahead, power it off. And I saw a little bit of fluid going through. I'm checking right now. So far, I've got one tube with fluid in it. So we've got one tube with fluid in it, and I am not seeing any leaks there. Let's go on to our front side. I'm not seeing any fluid either, so far good. As you saw, that drained really quickly. So that is why we went through the whole hard drive thing, because sometimes it'll take a little while, then it goes zoom, and it'll suck it down, and that's that time where we could be booting. And the last thing we want to do is get done with this and have hard drive issues. So our same thing going here. We will suck our fluid up into the bottle. Now, while you're doing this, definitely pay attention. You don't want to overfill this. That's fine. Let's bring it up to the top, or close to the top. One thing to be aware of when you pull this tube out, make sure you burp the tube. Because if you pull this out and there's still fluid in this, you're going to pull the tube out and that fluid is going to go bleh all over the system. I've done that at least once. It's not a huge deal because there's nothing really important down here, but it's going to make a mess you're going to have to clean up. So make sure that when you pull this out of this bucket and then when you pull it out of the reservoir, you drain any of the fluid that's in the tube so it doesn't go where you don't want it to go. So that is set up. I'm going to go to the backside, monitor things. Now we're going to get to the point where it's probably going to suck more fluid into the block. There's very little fluid in the block right now because it kind of bypassed it and went up into the radiator. So now we want to be diligent and pay close attention. So let's flip this on, monitor our fluid level. Look at the bottom base here of your block. That's good. And now we've got our block is fluid saturated, which is a great place to be. Now is where you really want to be diligent and look inside of this for any leaks or any issues. Now we're going to be looking, check the top of your block, make sure there's no fluid pooling on these fittings, touch them, make sure they are dry. Same thing with these bottom fittings, move your hands around them, just touch things, see if you can feel fluid. My fingers are nice and dry, so that is a good sign so far. Touch these. I can't get my finger in to touch these ones, but at least I can look at them. Maybe use a flashlight to get in there and just see if there's any fluid. I don't see any little bubbles that are coming out, like drop, 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 and making new bubbles. You're probably going to get some small bubbles coming out of these tubes here as the air comes out of your soft line tubes. But so far, we are holding fluid on the backside. Now, if you do end up in a situation where you get a leak, you want to have your pliers on standby and make note of the directions that we turned these earlier. So if I'm getting a leak out of this fitting, make sure that you grab it, tighten it the direction that it needs to be tightened. Same thing with these bottom ones. Grab it, tighten it. The front ones, these top collars, go toward the front of the system. The bottom ones would be the bottom collar next to this nut. That goes toward the back of the system. Those are probably the areas where you're going to get leaking from. Same thing with these ones. To tighten these, they go down. So you put this in, grab it, push it down. Hopefully, if there's any sort of a small leak, that will take care of it. I mean, if we did everything properly before, we tightened up everything, made sure things were tightened with these and weren't just like finger tight, then if you do encounter a leak, it's probably going to be small and it's not going to be catastrophic. If you do somehow have a catastrophic leak, that's where paper towel is. So I generally recommend having enough paper towel to sop up all the fluid in the system. And I've had that before where there's a big leak where maybe there's a torn O-ring or something that I can't fix, and it just keeps leaking, and there's no way that I can adequately drain the system in another way without this section of it draining. So in that case, you just have to keep going, swapping out paper towel, soaking up the fluid. If that happens, it sucks, which is why I recommend being very fastidious about checking over everything before we get to this process. But for the most part, leaks at this stage, if you did everything properly before and you don't have something like a torn O-ring inside of one of these fittings, you should be good to go. I'm going to go on to the other side of the system and just make sure that we don't have anything pooling on the floor. Nope. There's a little drop of fluid here, but that's just from when I filled it. That is not from the system itself. Now we want to look at the other end of these quick disconnects. Run your finger along the quick disconnects. Make sure that they are dry. You don't see any fluid that is coming down these tubes. So I just run my finger along things, and yeah, all of these are dry. I don't see anything running down the mainboard tray. I don't see anything pooling underneath my pump or oh, that's awesome. I just spilled my fluid. This is why I recommend having an extra bottle of fluid on standby. Yeah, I just spilled this whole bucket all over the floor. That was super fun. This is why I go over so many little details, because I know things can go wrong, especially from personal experience. And yeah, my finger caught the bucket and it said hello to my desk. Thankfully, I cleared everything below my desk, so there's nothing but carpet down here. It's just really, really meh industrial carpet, so it's fine. If that is your beautiful carpet at home or a nice Persian rug or something, you're going to be crying yourself to sleep if you have colored fluid. There we go. So now that our block is sort of fluid saturated, we have looked at it. It is not leaking to our knowledge so far. We can just start filling this reservoir all the way up, turning it on, pulling it down, and just repeating that process. So the block is saturated. I'm not as worried about it right now. Let me grab my power cord. So when you're expecting the block on the back of your computer, you want to check all the different fitting points. So we'll start up here, run your hands around it. Feels dry to me. Now these fittings here, these four, you can't necessarily get your finger back there, but usually if fluid starts spilling out of these, it's going to work its way along the back side of the block and it's going to start pooling here. So go ahead and just run your finger around these edges, feel especially right here at the back edge and along this lip. And if any fluid is coming out of these, within a few minutes you should start feeling it down here. Continue down, around, check these fittings down below. This is usually where I see the most fluid pooling out of, just doing it to the location of where it is. So just run your finger around here, make sure everything is dry. If everything looks good, go ahead and switch the computer on. We're going to see all kinds of little air bubbles continuing to flow through the system. That might go on for quite a while. Maybe even up to a few days as little air bubbles get dislodged from places and little areas deep inside of your cooling system. That's perfectly normal. And yeah, if we take a look here, this is looking nice and dry. I don't see any fluid leaks coming from around here. Go all the way up to the top, make it focus. Those fittings are looking nice and dry. We'll go back to our bottom here. Yep. So now we can just let the system run for a while and just kind of monitor for leaks. Make sure that there's no little small leaks that start over time. Probably a good time just to go around, because the back side looks fine. Double check the front side of the computer. Make sure that there are no amounts of fluid pooling down here or under the reservoir. Under the reservoir is a good place to check. Sometimes fluid will start leaking out. So this whole area between this edge and the same place on the back side of the computer are the two places you really want to check for fluid. Sometimes you'll see it leak down here near this Aventum logo. So just be mindful of any potential leaks. I've been in this computer for a little while now. The reservoir has drained a little bit. I can see a few little watermarks on this where it is drained over the course of maybe like the 30 or 40 minutes I've had it run as air bubbles go through the system. This is pretty good. There might be a little bit more, but I'm pretty confident that I can start topping this off, add fluid back into the system, get it up to that level where it's almost full, and then if we need to add a little bit more later, go ahead and do so. So let's just top this off real quick, and then we'll start the process of putting the computer back together. Go ahead and clean that off. We'll take our reservoir cap and just put it on there. So the first thing I want to do is unplug the computer, because we've got our little clip in here. So let's go ahead and pull our paper clip. We no longer need that. And we'll just start plugging things in. So on the motherboard here, I have all the cables that I unplugged earlier. 8-pin CPU power. 24-pin mainboard power. If you're wondering where the clip is, just reach your finger under there and feel it. Clip is on the bottom, so it orients like this. If you need to spread these little things out, go ahead and do it. They usually slide along like this. This is a dual proc rig. We have our secondary 8-pin power. On this system, we didn't unplug anything from this side because it was easier to unplug the cables from the back. If you unplugged your video cards, now go ahead and plug the connectors back in. Probably good just while you're here, just to make sure that everything is plugged in securely. One of these cables was slightly loose, so, you know, like anything you're working on, might as well just do a small inspection of little things, and if there's anything loose, go ahead and correct it. So we'll spin this around, and let's plug in our cables on the back side. So now that we're on the back side of the system, there's a few things that we can do. Let's go ahead, remove any of our paper towel. That is no longer needed. Oh, there's a little piece that got caught in there. Take this out. We had that tape strip that we put here under the block. So go ahead and remove that. We don't need that anymore. Take our power cables here. Now on this one, it looks like my sleeving got a little bit loose. So if you have to sleeve these, you just grab the 4 cables in a row, line them up, push, 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 and do the same for the back. They just clip in there, pretty simple. And let's just run these up to the top. Now there's 4 here. I didn't mention earlier, you might have more. You could have up to 8. But 3 or 4 is a pretty usual build unless the system is extreme. There we go. And we can cable manage these. So the whole point of this is to not only get the computer back up and running, but to have it look as beautiful as it did when we first started. There we go, a little bit of wire management, and that is looking good. So earlier we removed our LED strip and pulled off all that double-sided sticky foam. If you don't want to apply new stuff, you can just put this in here. Use your sponger or flat object, press it down. That is one option. Honestly, over time, this might come loose. Maybe yours is more sticky than mine. I've had my fingers over this a lot, so let's go ahead and do this the more appropriate way, where we will add new sticky tape. I have a roll of double-sided sticky tape here. You don't need this much. This is overkill. We just buy it in large quantities. You can find double-sided sticky tape at most hardware stores or even craft stores or places. So just go ahead, pick some up. Doesn't really matter. This doesn't have to be anything industrial or ultra heavy duty. Maybe 5 or 6 inch strips. Don't have to do it all at once. I find sometimes when you're working with like more than a foot of sticky tape at a time, it gets to be kind of a nightmare to manage. So smaller amounts is cool. So we'll just apply this. There we go. Now for my favorite part, finding an edge. There we go. There's 1/2. There we go. Now let's line this up. Make sure that we don't have too much at the bottom or the top. Make sure you don't overbend or twist one part of this. So you get it lined up. That is looking good. And now we'll just take our sponger. Oh, we're back here. Just, since we're pretty fresh out of rebuilding the system, run your finger again around any of these points. Make sure that in the time that you've run it, there's no small leaks. This, again, is a great place to check and see if fluid has come down from these 4 ports. Either fluid's going to be here or here. If these components are dry, you are good. Now, during our repair of this computer, we've probably got a bunch of dust and other things that are in there. So before we go ahead and button up the computer, grab some sort of a air duster. If you've got that big air duster from earlier, you can just go ahead and blast that out. I gave mine back to the guys in QA, so I've got my little hand pump one. Get in here, go ahead, dust along. If you have any areas where stuff is built up, just, now's a good time to clean it up. You spent a lot of money on this computer, so we might as well make sure when we're done with this project that it looks as beautiful as it did the day it arrived. So let's go ahead and put in our little plate that holds our Digital Storm logo on the backside. Now this piece fits in with the notched out end facing toward the inside of the computer. So it indents into the system. Right. Perfect. That is back in. Now let's grab our plate. Now it doesn't really matter which plate you grab. They're both very similar to each other. So whatever one. And let's see. Let's grab this. Line it up here. I got 2 pieces of plastic to align. Grab a screw, stick it on my screwdriver. There we go, that's on there. So let's switch back around to the other side of the computer. Now earlier, if we removed any hard drives, you want to go ahead and put them back into the computer. To put them back in, just slide it in until it clicks. Then this little lever here gets pushed down, and that's all. If you had a M.2 drive, this is also where you'd want to go ahead and put it back in. We opted not to remove ours because it was covered behind 3 graphics cards, so that's why we did all the power cables. But yes, this would now be a good time to plug in any of your drives. Probably just double check while we're at this point too to make sure any of these cables going into this board at the top are plugged in. They are. Everything's nicely seated. Double check any of your other cables. These are all nice and seated in here. Yep, that's good, that's good. Oh, now the only thing we have left is to put this logo plate on and our side panels. That's back in, all of our drives are in. Now let's go through and clean this out. Any little fingerprints or anything that we got on the system, go ahead and wipe it down. Let's grab our side panels, put them back on, just line it up, clip. Same thing with our back panel. Excellent. So with everything back together, the computer should look like it did when it first arrived to you. You definitely want to fire it up. I can't fire mine up because, like I said earlier, this has a bad motherboard, and it's why I used it for this video. But now is the point you want to fire up the computer. Make sure you're able to boot into Windows or boot into whatever your operating system drive is. If you're having any issues with that, the first thing I can tell you is just tap delete when you load up the computer. That will load you into BIOS. You can usually go in and look for some sort of a section that says boot or boot order. Make sure whatever your main OS drive, whether it's an M.2 or an SSD, is at the top of the list. Sometimes it'll get a little reordered, and it might be trying to boot off of like your data hard drive or your CD-ROM drive or something which you don't have anything on, so it gives you disk boot failure. If you're getting a disk boot failure, that is probably what is happening. I can't give you detailed information on that because, again, there's like 50 different motherboards that we offer, but if that is the case, go ahead and give our support staff a call. They will help get that all taken care of. If there's any other issues that you have, whether you still have leaks or anything, and this guy doesn't help you with any particular issue, go ahead, call our support staff and let them know, and they can take things from there and help to resolve any issues you have remaining with your computer. But thank you so much for following through this. I hope this was helpful for everyone. So thank you, and have a good rest of your day.